got a lot to cover. First of all, the little transceiver itself, taking it apart, looking at the construction, the circuits. We need to go through this radio. There's a lot of interest in the Swan 100. I also want to talk about why these solid-state type transceivers do like a small tuner between the antenna and the transceiver. Not as much to do anything with the antenna, but to allow the radio to present the full power to the antenna as sort of a matching network. And this is a very simple tuner we'll go over. It's basically just a pi filter type tuner with a tapped coil. Back on the power front, I alluded that we had an AC power supply that was developed based on an old computer ATX type supply, and it's running the radio beautifully. It's quite a nice little supply for about an hour of work to produce something like this. We've got our storage battery, and we'll go through the storage battery and circuit breaker or fusing the battery, charging the battery, both with a bench supply, and we have a solar panel here. This is a small 30-watt panel. We're going to operate that as a trickle charger on the battery, both as just a simple strap-on type charger, and also we're going to use a PWM controller, which should be able to get more juice into the battery. Finally, we'll go outside and we'll talk about antennas. We will actually put up an efficient antenna for emergency purposes, and we're going to run the whole thing outside and make a couple of contacts outdoors using the solar panel assisted power supply. So some of you no doubt have a lot of questions about the Swan 100, and let's go into a little bit of history. The Swan company, of course, was making tube-type transceivers in the 1960s and competing very favorably with higher-priced radios from Hallicrafters and Heathkit and Collins and so on, National. So once we got into competition with the Japanese radios, which came in the early 70s, everybody knew that it was going to have to go to solid state, and a lot of the companies were experimenting with solid state radios at that time. One of the first was the Atlas company, and it turns out the pedigree of this radio is related to that same development program. But by the time we get into the late 70s, even though we've got low-cost components, and I'll show you some of those, and we have integrated circuits showing up that can handle whole sections of the radio, it starts to become a war of attrition in that the cost of labor and the scope and work that could be put into the factory itself, and it's all just the scale of it got out of control for the smaller American companies. No longer could a mom-and-pop company compete with a large Japanese corporation that had a workforce that was a lot more economical for them, as well as some subsidizing occurring from the government. So it was pretty soon companies like Swan realized that the end was near, and they ended up getting into the government and commercial radio business. It became Cubic Corporation. As a matter of fact, this radio is sometimes known as the Cubic 100MX because it's a crossover radio. Let's take a close look at some of the components used in the radio. The first thing that stands out is this interesting permeability tuned oscillator. A PTO is a device that changes its frequency by making a slug of powdered iron or ferrite go in and out of the coil to actually tune it. So no variable capacitors. So as you tune the front dial, it goes in and out very slowly. And this is a really beautiful tuning mechanism with virtually no backlash, very smooth, very precise, and very expensive to manufacture. And immediately in back of that we have this beautiful single sideband filter system. This filter, this crystal filter, lattice filter, is an expensive component in the radio. So we do have a dual gain variable here, which is your combination of the front end preselector and for the transmit drive tuning. So when you peak the radio for listening, basically, you've also peaked the transmit section. This is a single conversion transceiver. That is, two oscillators are flopped back and forth and used in both the receive and the transmit sections. Back here we have the power amplifier and output filters. It's a broadband power amplifier. It has a series of compound pi filters in the output, one for each band that it's on. Of course, there were only 5 ham bands at that time that were really popular. This doesn't have 160 and it doesn't have the WARC bands that would come later. But this type of construction is very nice because it's modular. You've got some driver filter components here. You have essentially the IF of the radio here. You've got a standalone noise blanker here. And the whole radio is like that. It's all built in sections. Extremely easy to work on compared to the Japanese radios, which are kind of a tough to work on the inside. This one's a pleasure to work on and troubleshoot. So the next question is, why did the hams leave their American manufacturers behind and go immediately to the so-called rice boxes, to the Japanese radios? Well, ham operators generally like to have a lot of features. They like a high performance radio, and those radios were able to give you more features at a lower cost. And I think that bang for the buck sells radios. It still does today. And there is a price point, and if you can beat that price point, you win. And that's what happened. So the American manufacturers either had to go out of business or they had to move on into other business where they could be profitable, such as military contracting, for instance. Okay, it's time to get into a little more emotional subject, and of course I'm talking about antennas. What's a great antenna for emergency operation? That's kind of a loaded question. Should I be using a vertical? Should I be using a horizontal antenna? Which works best? Which is the easiest to put up? You know, it's really hard to beat the good old-fashioned long wire antenna, and especially the inverted L version of it, where you just throw a wire up over a tree and then tag the far end out to a bush or another tree, and then you use a series L-match type tuner. You're on the air. Maybe you put a ground rod in. Very simple, guaranteed to work, and it's an effective antenna. But I think as far as efficiency goes, it's very hard to beat the old-fashioned dipole, the horizontal dipole. And I'm going to push a version of the dipole that I feel is the easiest to get up and the fastest to get up, and that's the inverted V. An inverted V, you have a chunk of coax, you attach the wire to the coax, you pull it up into the tree, and then the ends droop down and you can put them on 2 bushes. Bingo, you're on the air. As far as simplicity goes, the fan version of the dipole, or the fan dipole, specifically cut for the frequencies that you think you're going to need. I like 80, 40, and 20 because that's where most of the emergency nets are. That's where most of the action's going to be. Usually those bands are open, and usually those bands are being listened to. Maybe you want to throw 30 meters on there. There's going to be a lot of emergency traffic in those 5 channels. I think naturally that's a good coordinated band. The 18 megahertz band, 17 meters. 17 meters has become more and more important. So maybe attack 5 wires on your fan dipole, but at least have 80, 40, and 20. So when you're putting together your fan dipole, it's always good to have a balun up here. A couple of beads will do okay. or you can make a loop balun. It's not perfect. RG6 TV line makes excellent feed line for a emergency dipole. When you're measuring your elements, make sure that you make the length a little bit longer than what you need and fold it back along the wire. And that way you can adjust it without having to cut the wire. So there's a million ways to put up the antenna, but everything from slingshots to fancy bows and arrows and launchers. I'm going to use my bass rod. I'm going to put this bolt up through the antenna. And then I will pull this twine back through and bring the center of the dipole up. Okay, on the first shot with the bass rod, you can see the bolt is wiggling around right there. I shot it up and got it up to that place where those two branches just come back against the tree. That's not bad. That looks like it's about 40 feet up. That'll be fine for the dipole. Okay, the next thing you have to do is set your orientation on the antenna. What direction do you want to favor with the antenna? I'm choosing an antenna that lies in a northwest to southeast type of pattern. That's going to favor both the whole United States from New England and also possibly towards Europe, and this northwest to the southeast type pattern doesn't, it's not like you're going to need a lensatic compass to set this up. Just orient it so generally you're covering most of the area that you are interested in talking to. I'm fairly happy with the fan dipole. As you can see, the fan dipole is more of an inverted V, but most of the elements are coming off, you know, close to 160 degrees. So it's a dipole more than an inverted V. And notice they're coming off at different angles, favoring different areas, but more importantly, that helps to decouple the wires. And I think it makes it easier to tune than if they're all just on top of each other. So let's talk about the tuner for a minute. Now with our fan dipole, we're not talking about a great mismatch. If we cut the wires basically to the half-wave formula, and you're drooping down toward the ground, they're probably going to be a little bit long, a little bit low in frequency, and I'd rather be a little long than a little bit short, because you can always trim the wires. Probably anything from a 1-to-1 to a 5-to-1 can be handled pretty easily with a pi match. Once you get beyond that, now you need to have more exotic tuners. But for now, this very simple pi match is what's going to do the job. Inside, we've got about 15 turns of number 12 wire, and it's tapped about every 4 turns, and I have a rotary switch that simply shorts out the coil. On each side, I have 2 double section 365 caps. So that's 720, 730 caps on each side. And sometimes you do need even more capacitance than that. So I have some rotary switch. I have a rotary switch that puts up to 700 picofarads extra on one side. And that allows me to match just about anything I can come up with these dipole type systems that are fairly close to 50 ohms. As we get to the higher frequencies, 17 meters all the way up to really 6 meters, and you're more interested in mobile to base station type communications, it makes a lot more sense to use an omnidirectional antenna like a vertical or a ground plane antenna. So let's not forget the ground plane. It's another very easy to erect system. It's just about foolproof. Just like we did with our fan dipole, you can pull it right up into a tree, and it makes an excellent antenna if you can get it up high enough. Don't be afraid to get the antenna up 50 or 60 feet, and almost any coax will work with it. You'll have some SWR, of course, if you're using 75 ohm coax, but it's not hard to match into 75 ohms with 50 ohm transceiver with a small tuner like I showed you. Okay, so we have our little setup outdoors. I'll show you the solar panel. And we have our storage battery. And we have the radio set up. I have a tuner. I've not even hooked up the antenna yet. I'm going to go get that. Okay, right now I want to check the open circuit voltage on the solar panel. Let's see what that's sitting at. 21.42 volts. 21 volts. Now this particular panel is a small panel and it's only, 30 watt or so. It has a protection diode. I checked with the manufacturer. It has a protection diode, which means that the battery can't back bias the cells and destroy them. That's very important. If you don't have that protection, you should add a Schottky diode. Okay, next I want to check to see what the connection of the solar cell directly to the battery with no controller is going to do. I have the meter in amps, and I'm reading 1.69. Okay, going through the controller, we got about 1.44 amps. And that's how we're going to try to run the radio. So next we hook up the radio.
But at least you got some of your cameras working. I think you have 3 in total. But you're 0DK, be safe out there. This is Midcars, K8HLJ, taking any check-ins. Let me try.
Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta, WU2D.
Okay, we have a 0 Alpha Oscar, K4JER. Good morning, Jerry. WU4 Delta. I missed one. Who did I miss? Good morning. Great Tango into Vermilion, Ohio. Again, my name is George. Street down now. Jerry, K4JER. Come on in. Stand by 2 Delta. Thanks for coming into Midcars this morning, Jerry. You take it easy there. Okay, yeah, we're not a high speed yet. We'll go 18, 19, 20 miles worth a minute, but anybody is welcome, and we'll be glad to hear you down there. Okay, hey, 73, Jerry, thanks for coming into Midcars. We'll play with K4JER. Let's go Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta. Come on in, stand by Fred.
This is Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta on emergency power from New Hampshire, from Manchester, New Hampshire, doing a demonstration of ham radio using battery power with a solar assist. The name is Mike, Mexico, India, Kilo, Echo, and I'm using a Swan 100 MX solid state radio from WU2D.
Well, good morning to you. I'm not familiar with the Swan MX 100 and the solid state version of that, but you have a nice signal into Vermilion, Ohio. Mike, I'm on the shore of Lake Erie. I'm 35 miles west of Cleveland. Again, my name is George, and we've got, you know what, the emergency power there, it's great for demonstration, but just a couple of days ago, we lost power for about 6 hours over here in this area. High winds were going through, 50-mile-an-hour winds, took a tree down the road, and we were without for about 5 or 6 hours, so good to have that available for you.
Well, 73s, and thanks for letting me into the net for this demo. This is WU2D.
WU2D 73, Mike. This is K8HLJ. Do we have any mobile check-ins? No mobiles here at any station. Fixed or mobile, come now.
So again, we are using the fan dipole that we erected. We have not touched the dipole. We have not tuned it. We've not trimmed it. We simply hauled it up and used it with a small tuner. So the next test is to see how bad the antenna is on that particular frequency we were just using. So I've tuned just a little off frequency. I've taken the tuner out. So I've removed the tuner. This is the antenna straight into the radio. Let's check the SWR. Well, according to my matched my cross needle, it's just a hair below 5 to 1. 5 to 1 SWR. That's a pretty bad mismatch, but you know what? It didn't matter. With the antenna matcher in line, the radio was able to deliver power to that mismatch, and we had a good signal. No problem whatsoever. So don't worry too much about your SWR. Worry about making the radio happy. And 5 to 1 sounds bad, but it's a lot better than infinity. Piece of coax, low loss, very short run up to the antenna. That SWR doesn't mean a lot. So if you're curious, the antenna is tuned way too low. It's resonating around 6.8 megahertz. So we would have to, if we wanted to match the antenna, we would have to lower it. We'd have to shorten it by a couple feet on each end to bring it back up into the band. So it's close, but no cigar. Now on 80 meters, it seems to be better matched to the low end of the band. Almost perfectly matched around 3570, so it'd be good for CW region, untouched on the 80 meter band. Got a little bit lucky on that one. No trimming necessary unless you want to go up to the sideband area. Again, you've got to take a couple feet off the ends if you want to bring it up into the phone section. The tuner can easily take care of that. So I need to get at that power amp section. This is the power amp section in the back. And it looks like the way that they made you have access was by removing the screws on the sides. And of course the top and the bottom covers had to come off. And this whole thing will unplug by use of some simple Motorola connectors, RCA connectors, I'm sorry. These RCA connectors, pop those out, and perhaps a couple of unsoldering, and we'll have that whole thing on the bench as a standalone driver and power amplifier section. We don't need the final filtering in order to see if this thing has problems with the power transistors. So this seems to be the satisfactory method of looking at the power amp while everything is pretty much still connected. I did have to disconnect the output. Hard to believe they put 100 watts through this little piece of coax, but it is good quality coax. It's, you know, it's probably pushing a little bit, but that's what they used. They have a fairly tiny switch here that goes into the filter bank as well. But beside the dainty parts, it's a pretty nice build. It's reminiscent of late 70s, early 80s type of construction. Lots of tunable cans and coils, and of course it would stay like that for many years until we really got some software-defined radios in place. So the classic Motorola application note AN762, linear amplifiers for mobile operation, was the kind of the germ of a lot of these amplifiers. It's what got people used to the Class AB push-pull circuits using these high-power bipolar stages. And a lot of these early radios are based on that circuit. So it's a great, 12 to 14 volt type thing. Works great in the car, and you don't have to go crazy with the biasing. You can use a 723 regulator, any adjustable regulator, or in this case, they use diodes to basically forward bias a diode, and it gives you some adjustment of the bias that tracks with the transistors. Okay, so we have got the radio all apart now, and in order to get the power amp separated from the main radio, you have to put things up to the point where they're at just the right height so that everything seems to agree. Our microphone seems to be working okay, so the telephone element is doing fine. Now we're just looking at the exciter output here before the PA on the scope. This was not very easy to take apart. I had to separate the power amplifier from the exciter. We're just looking at the exciter on the scope. Seems to be working okay, although I don't seem to have any CW drive, so I've got to find out why the CW is not keying properly. But that doesn't have anything to do with the power amp. The power amp, I'm able to inject into it and get output now. I played with the temperature compensation for the bias, and that seems to be working right now. So I'm going to start to put things back together. Need to get this thing back together so we can do a full alignment on it. So the little Swan radio is now in functional condition. These radios that are gotten out of the attic are going to have things wrong with them. They're not going to be fully operational, but they still might let you get on the air in an emergency. Wow, he's using an old Century 21 CW transceiver, which is even older than this guy. It goes back to the early 70s. One of the very first solid-state transceivers by Tentec. So basically I do want to test the power supply to see if it works. The green wire has to be connected to a black wire, and that activates the power supply. So that's what I'll eventually put the on-off switch on. Also, there has to be a load on the 5-volt supply, which is the red wires. So I'll probably put a resistor on there to draw about an amp, just to make sure the power supply thinks there's a PC connected, and then it will turn on. And then we'll check the various voltages, just a quick check to make sure the supply works. So first of all, I took all of the yellow wires that I could find, turned out to be 7 yellow wires, and paralleled all of them and brought them to the fuse. I have a fuse holder that's capable of handling 25 amp fuses. I've got a 20 amp fuse in there. I counted the same number of black wires as yellow wires for the return. And of course there's many more black wires than there are yellow wires, because you need a black return wire for every color, the orange, red, and the yellow. But there's no sense in putting more yellow wires or more black wires than more yellow wires. 6 or 7 of those wires is easily equivalent to a piece of number 10 anyway. So you're not going to do much better by using more. The black and the green are shorted together here on this terminal strip. That also is a convenient ground point for the 330 ohm resistor that I'm using as the 5-volt load, that together with the green and black together and the 330 ohm load resistor that guarantees that the ATX thinks it's talking to a computer and it turns on. That also is a convenient tie point for the LED return, so putting a little terminal strip in there was not a bad idea. There's an alien here. It's a 4700 mic 25 volt electrolytic right across the output terminals. That is kind of a shock capacitor when we're using a ham transceiver and we're keying, or we're using single sideband. That capacitor takes the edge off and allows the switcher to respond in time. It also adds some noise reduction and some filtering. I noticed that this particular supply has a capacitor and a resistor and a very simple IEC input. Not a lot of filtering on this compared to some of the other supplies. Look at this other ATX supply. It has a wonderful brute force filter. So if you find that the supply is actually putting out noise, or more noise than you think it should, then you might want to retrofit it with one of these very nice Corcom type filters. And these provide excellent RFI protection. Or make your own. The other thing you could do is slip a ferrite bead onto the AC cord, and you might want to put one on the DC feed as well to reduce RFI from the switcher. So one thing, just for completeness, we need to discuss is we've got this fantastic ATX power supply that we're powering our little transceiver with, and you know, it's all well. But remember, it is a switching power supply made for a computer. And when we turn that thing on, is that going to interfere with receivers, specifically with its own receiver, but maybe other receivers in the shack? The power supply negative terminal and positive terminal are going through this cord made up of a pair of number 12 wires. It's about 4 feet long, going to the back of the radio. It's a twisted pair. That helps to reduce noise. But the chassis is not connected directly to the negative. It's isolated, and that's a good thing. But that also means the chassis is not connected to the chassis of the radio. So I've made a small ground wire here. It's a green ground wire. Does it have to be green? Well, yes, it does have to be. No, it doesn't have to be green. It can be any wire that's of a reasonable size. Proper grounding between the two chassis. And the next thing we're going to try is some ferrite bead action. Okay, we have added 2 ferrite beads. 1 bead to the power cord, and we've taken the power cables, the DC power feed, and wrapped it a full turn through this larger bead. So we got a full turn around that particular bead. And we now have our ground wire attached. Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta, Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta.
Whiskey United 3 Delta, Ocean Kilo to Radio Zulu. Hope I got the call correct. Is it you, Don? Over.
It's Whiskey Uniform 2 Delta, WU2D. The name is Mike, Mexico, India, Kilo, Echo. Beautiful signal, Yuri. You're 5'9" here in New Hampshire.
Roger, Mike. The Whiskey United 2 Delta, got the number 2. Okay, nice to hear again. You're 5 by 8, 58, nice signal. And by the way, I found you in my log a number of years ago, back in December of 2006, some almost 14 years ago. Is it the same call with the same person, Mike, after so many years, over?
That's a Roger, Yuri. Yes, you've got it correct. I was doing a little bit of DXing on 75 meters back then on single sideband. But just playing with a little radio here. This is a little Swan 100. It's a vintage solid state radio from the 70s that I'm bringing back to life. Over.
Roger, Roger. Sounds still pretty good. Very, very good signal from the old radio, Mike.
So I had kind of an odd inquiry, but I guess it's not so odd. People were asking, well, if there is an emergency, and it is a serious incident, where will I find these people that want to communicate with me? And it's kind of a loaded question, because people that consider themselves off-gridders and beyond generally do not want to communicate with other people because they have a security situation that if they transmit, they know they will be geolocated or some other means to find their place. So if you don't want to be found, the last thing you want to be is on a regular net. However, putting that aside and going back into ham radio again, there certainly are emergency nets and nets that handle emergency traffic that have gone on since the beginning of ham radio. So I'll put a list up of some of those frequencies and places you can monitor as a shortwave listener, and you can get emergency information. So as exhausting as this list of frequencies looks, it's by no means complete. These are the common frequencies that you'll see if you tune in, that you might hear something. There's a lot of traffic nets. Some of them are single sideband, some of them are CW, and many of them are digital now. Emergency nets and emergency response communications have been around for a long time on the ham bands. There's also some coordination between the government and ham radio operators. And there are various disaster entities that have frequencies that have been allocated to them by the FCC and the NTIA. So there's a mix of frequencies here. Not all of them are on the ham bands. And if this section's boring to you, just skip through it. But I did want to put up some frequencies that you might look for in the event of an emergency or disaster, because a lot of these will be busy. So this section also includes some coordinated nets, which means that the federal government, different state and local entities and hams can use similar frequencies. FEMA, of course, has all of the frequencies that they need to use. Some of the preppers, survivalists, and off-gridders actually have nets on the ham radio bands. Now, whether these would be active or not in an actual emergency, who knows, but they're used for training. And since they were on the internet, I put them up for you guys. So in this video, we've covered a lot of ground. I think we've introduced the Swan 100 transceiver. I understand it's quite collectible and people are looking for these radios. It's funny to think that Classic will include solid-state radios, but that's the way it is now. It's not just old tube stuff. People are starting to collect some of that golden era of the 70s and 80s transceivers.